happy to have Zara here. Zara earned her PhD in 2018 from UMass Amherst Department of Environmental Conservation, and she currently works for UMass Clean Energy Extension on different projects related to environmental effects of renewable energy development, as well as local clean energy planning and implementation. And I forgot to mention that out there in the registration table, there are long-form speaker bios if you want to learn a little bit more about those that are speaking today. So you can refer to those, and if you didn't grab one, it's back there on the table. So Zara is going to speak today about some of the research that's been done on dual use in Massachusetts.
I'm going to cover sort of the dual use, trialing dual use in Massachusetts from a UMass extension perspective, and we've been involved from sort of three angles. The first one is, I think Jerry alluded to the fact that there's these agricultural STGU guidelines, and one of the guidelines is that when the farmer's developing a dual-use project, they have to do that in conjunction with UMass extension. So the way that that's played out is that they end up consulting both with Clean Energy Extension, who I work for, and with UMass agricultural extension. And basically what happens is the solar developer goes through the normal process of submitting an application through SMART, but then there's also that predetermination form that Jerry talked about, which they submit as a draft form to extension. We review it with our ag colleagues. There's typically a site visit with the farmer and the developer and Jerry, someone from MDAR, sometimes someone from DOER. Then the applicant has the opportunity to review that plan before they submit it for final approval to MDAR and DOER. So we don't play any role in the decision-making process, but the idea is that we're helping provide guidance. And there's a number of different components to that predetermination form, but basically the idea is just to get a sense of what's already going on at that farm, and then as they're incorporating solar, making sure that they've sort of thought through every step of what they're going to be doing under and around that solar array to make sure that that solar array design is going to be compatible with the farming that they're planning to do. So that's what we basically try to provide kind of some comments and guidance and response on. But in order to do that, you have to know something. So, when this program got rolling, I'd say the second thing that we tried to do is do a lot of background research about dual use and also just understanding the SMART regulation ourselves. So a lot of the fact sheets and resources that we came up with were just sort of, here's how the SMART program works, here's how the incentive structure works, and trying to be available for farmers and developers. But I also tried to delve into the literature and see what was available, what information was available about dual use and what we could do in terms of offering advice to farmers and developers. And unfortunately, I got this giant pile of papers at the top of the screen. There's not a lot of research. There's not a lot of published scientific data on dual use. I think this is a good kind of cross-section of what's out there. So there's a lot of modeling papers that say, this is a more efficient way to use land. Do dual use, do solar and ag on the same land. It's more efficient than doing with monocultures of solar panels and crops. But that's modeling. That's not a lot of on-the-ground work. There's some work from sort of some dry lands and some tropical areas where, in I think some cases, that shading is actually useful because you've got hotter temperatures. It can help maintain soil moisture. And Jordan may be talking about this Oregon study. I'm not sure if he's going to touch on that later. And then there's a couple of papers about growing lettuce under shade, but there's just really not a lot of scientific data, especially for the Northeast. If you go into the kind of unpublished studies, there's a lot of anecdotal information. People have been grazing sheep under solar panels for years without kind of noticeable reductions in yield that they say this works pretty well. And we also, for pasture systems, there is some information about effects of shade because people have done sort of pasture orchard mixed systems. So we do have some information about the shade tolerance of grasses and forbs. And we sort of generally know, like, some vegetables tend to be more tolerant of shade than others. Like, we tend to think, okay, tomatoes, peppers, they really need a lot of sun. Something like kale might be a little more tolerant. Massachusetts, I don't know how much of an industry there is here in New York, but in Massachusetts we've got a lot of cranberry production. Those plants are understory plants. They definitely can survive in shade, but the question is how much fruit production is reduced by shading. And again, so there's just not a lot of information. that's available either anecdotally or in published form. So Jerry spoke before about this UMass research project, and this is sort of a third way that UMass Extension has been involved in actually doing on-the-ground dual-use research. And this is really the only research that I've been able to come across that looks at vegetable production, or really any kind of production in dual-use systems in the Northeast. So this is work by Extension Professor Stephen Herbert. As Jerry said, this was the more recent, at least the recent work was funded by the National Renewable Energy Lab, and they've been working with Hyperion and some other folks on this project. It's a small-scale study, so it's just a 25 kilowatt array, and I'm just going to go over some of his results really briefly. And these are not published results. These are just from his research reports, which are he's made publicly available. They're on our website, so on the Clean Energy Extension website if you want to check them out. But basically, it sort of was an interesting study because the first year they did it, 2016, was an extreme drought year in Massachusetts. I have a 100-year-old well and it went dry. I had to have a new well dug. Like, it was a very extreme drought year. And because of that, probably because of that, the vegetable growth under the panels was actually better than it was in the open field environment, or it was sort of a wash. So you can see here with Swiss chard, it was actually growing significantly better. Those 2 foot through 5 foot, that's like the different panel spacings that they looked at versus no panel. And you can see that it actually did better under the panel in that extreme drought year than it did in the open field. But in subsequent years, as you might expect, there was a significant reduction in yield under the panels for Swiss chard in 2017 and 2018. I'm going to show you a summary of all of this in a minute, but sort of a similar story for peppers. It was kind of a wash between under the panels and not under the panels in 2016 when there was that extreme drought. And then in subsequent years when you had more typical growing years for Massachusetts, you saw that there was a significant decline in yield under the panels, particularly in 2018. So this is a summary slide I put together, which is, like I said, he hasn't published this. Even the exact numbers of that yield is not available. So these are my estimates based off the graphs that he has provided. But basically, this is the change in yield, just looking at fresh weight, since that's probably what's going to be most relevant to farmers for all these different crops. And you can sort of see that trend that I suggested, where in 2016, it was either a wash, broccoli, kale, pepper, sort of not really significant changes under the panels or in the full sun. Swiss chard and beans actually did better in the full sun, better under the panels in 2016. But in 2017 and 2018, you see really significant reductions in yield. And that's true both for, peppers, which you might think of as something that would need a lot of sun, but also for things like broccoli and kale that you might think would be more tolerant of shade. So I'm going to give a little summary in a minute, but you can kind of see there that there are some concerns that there could be significant reductions in yield with this dual-use system. And then the other research that UMass Extension has been engaged in is Giverson Mupambi and Hillary Sandler of the UMass Cranberry Station have been working just starting this summer with a local cranberry grower on his bog to try to replicate the effects of shading of tracking panels with these less expensive than a tracking panel plywood contraptions. So they've been out there. It was still quite a project to get these set up, but they've been out there starting to look at effects on yield and also looking at the microclimate under those panels, because they think that it might actually moderate that microclimate. So there could actually be advantages in terms of reducing sun scald and reducing risks of frost. But sort of to be determined. This just got, I think it just got going in July, so this is very new. So if I was going to review the research, I would say basically there's very little scientific data on effects of shading on yield, almost no data for the northeastern United States. Basically, there's Stephen Herbert's work. We can see that shading does appear, if you kind of connect the data points, it appears to be potentially an asset in dry conditions. But this vegetable yield appears to be quite significantly affected. It is a small-scale study. We haven't looked at this writ large, but it does, even for these shade-tolerant species. So, this is sort of the like, I'm not trying to be a downer, but like this is a cause for concern. And then something that our agricultural colleagues have said, which I think is really important, is that There's also a lot of additional labor and concern with having to navigate in, around, and under the panels. And if it's something like livestock grazing where you don't have to get heavy machinery in there all the time, and where the livestock are grazing right up to the panels, you're still going to have to get in there occasionally with equipment probably, but it's not going to be as big of a logistical hurdle. But if you're doing vegetable production and you're under there all the time for every stage of production, there's going to be a lot of additional costs, and there's also going to be sort of an area, you can't hit the poles, right? So you have to stay back a couple feet on either side from those poles whenever you're doing any kind of machine-controlled cultivating or weeding. So you're going to have to deal with weeds somehow, whether that's putting down an amazing amount of weed mat, right, all along that panel row, and then replacing that repeatedly, or whether that's going to be going in by hand, or whether that's using additional herbicide. But that's an additional cost, and there are other labor costs that haven't really been looked at for kind of vegetable production under dual use arrays. So I think that's important to think about. Like I said, from the livestock perspective, people have been less concerned. There's still not really any data on yield, but people seem less worried about the effects on yield, and also the logistics are a little bit clearer. So, I guess thinking about this meeting, Massachusetts has been incentivizing this program, and has been incentivizing dual use. It sounds like New York is thinking about doing that. And, I just think it's worth kind of taking a step back and thinking about what are your goals, who's going to benefit from the program, who should you consult in developing that program, and then what's this larger context of energy development in the state that was alluded to at the beginning of this conversation. So I can't go through all this because I could talk for a while. I could talk during the questions session. But, as Jerry said, the goal of the program, at least from my understanding, was to reduce conflicts between solar PV development and agriculture. We want to keep agricultural land in commercial production. We still want to provide this alternative revenue stream of solar to farms. And, my concern here is that we're seeing, at least for vegetable production, is that really going to be commercial scale production if you're having a 50% decline in yield? That doesn't necessarily seem like the best way to go about it or the most efficient use of land. The science isn't there to tell us what that's going to be or what crops would work and so forth. One thing we've seen in Massachusetts is that a lot of cranberry bogs in Massachusetts are classified as wetlands, so you wouldn't be allowed to develop solar on them in other cases, but because through the dual use program you are. So that's actually encouraging more development of agricultural land. It may be, like I said, they're doing this research, it may be that it actually still has significant amounts of yield even without, even with dual use, but we don't know that yet. And also, in a lot of cases the cranberry growers don't care because they're actually losing money on their crop at the moment, so they're looking forward to having that solar stream. So it becomes a very kind of convoluted, confusing what those incentives are actually promoting. And then, okay, I'll try to be really quick. You also want to think about the beneficiaries of the program. Because this was a solar incentive program, the people that found out about it are solar developers. So they're not always thinking about, first, let's put it on a barn, second, let's put it on a greenhouse, third, let's put it on marginal land, fourth, let's put it on on actual active farmland. Their direction is to head towards a big project that is at a good interconnection point that they can make a profit on, and that's their job. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily thinking about the farm as a whole. And then also we have to remember that this is benefiting owners of farmland, and many farmers, a very large percentage of farmland is rented or leased. So, if it's actually creating competition for them, but if there's any kind of program that's providing an incentive to put solar, whether it's ground-mounted or dual use, on ag land, it's actually creating a competition between someone who might use that for farming and someone who might use that for solar. So, talking about stakeholders, UMass Extension was not actually consulted before this regulation. They were written into the regulation, they weren't consulted. I think there's a lot of groups that it would benefit to hear from those stakeholders and experts. And then finally, just thinking about this larger context of energy development, I know for Massachusetts, we're going to have to go from about 2.5 to 50 gigawatts of solar to meet our renewable energy targets, according to a recent analysis, which is great. But if we continue on our current trajectory that we have in Mass, where it's about 75% on undeveloped land, including under SMART, that's 150,000 acres in our state, which is I think it's a very large block of our undeveloped land. So I think we need to think long term. We need to think to 2050. If we really are, what is the solar capacity that we need to have? How much of that can we put on developed land and buildings and that kind of thing? And then, okay, so we're going to have some on undeveloped land. How do we structure and incentives to, preserve our agricultural and ecological resources to the extent possible? That's it. Thank you.